All right, so let's get going on today's class. So before we begin the advanced lab portion of today's class, just want to go over the next assignment in the professional development social media assignment that we're doing this semester. So I'm seeing a lot of you completed assignment number 1. Congratulations on that. So what we're going to do is we're going to continue to build on developing this, your social media presence. So far, you've gotten yourself a Twitter account, you followed me at Polite and Sane, and you followed one additional IUSB psychology professor. And what we're looking to do right now is we're just kind of looking to get everybody plugged into the networks and the circles that professional psychologists inhabit. So the next thing that we want you to do for this is pretty simple. Just get on Twitter, and you are going to follow 5 psychologists on Twitter. So 5 professional psychologists. You will search for them, find their accounts, find them on Twitter, and then just follow those on your account. Now, these can be any professional psychologist that you choose, and you can do this based on your own interests. What I would recommend is because you are getting very close to graduation, it is a good time to start thinking about what is that next step that you want to take. And it is a very good time to start to make yourself visible to people who are going to make the decision on what is that next step that you're going to take. So if you are, this assignment, this portion of it is going to be a little bit different for everybody, depending upon whether you think that you're going to graduate and go off and get a job in the psychology field, or if you're thinking about going to grad school instead, depending upon what you believe your career trajectory is going to be, I would recommend doing this part of the assignment kind of tailored to your own particular interests. So, for example, if you're going to be applying to grad school, or if you already applied to grad school, one of the things that you want to do is you want to start becoming part of these communities so that you get a little bit of name recognition out there, so that people that will be making the decision on the future of your academic career will kind of know and be familiar with you a little bit. So if I was going to grad school or applying to grad school, if that was in my plan and I had this opportunity, what I would do is I would start thinking about what are the grad schools I want to go to. So let's say that I chose Stanford. Stanford is like my top choice. What I would do would be to, and what I recommend is go to their faculty web pages, or if it's a business, go to their personnel web pages and start finding people that have interests aligned with what you are interested in. So one of the nice things about Stanford's web page is that they actually list what each of the faculty in their psychology department is interested in, and you can just kind of scroll down until you find something that you're interested in. So for me, meaning and mental representation, perception, those were areas that I work in. So if I was doing this assignment, I might say to myself, all right, Jamil Zaki, that seems like somebody that I want to make sure I'm in their circle of contacts and their network of connections. So if you click on his page there, it'll take you to his faculty website, and a quick Google search took me to his Twitter page, and then add him to your follow list, and do that for 4 more psychologists. So at this point, we're not interacting too much. We're not actually tweeting anything yet. If you do, feel free to do that if you feel like you want to take it there at this point. But for right now, all we want to do is just follow individuals and just start getting yourself plugged into that circle, start seeing what they're talking about and the things that they are talking about. So when you do this, if you can upload a screenshot, I put in assignments in professional development step 2. If you can just upload a screenshot of the 5 psychologists that you followed. So just go to your Twitter account, go to your following page, and just send in a screenshot of that. And we'll do this for a week. So you got until next Monday, January 21st at 11:59. All right, any questions on this before we go to the advanced lab portion of today? All right, so before we get to that, just real quickly, because we do have accounts right now, one of the things that you do want to make sure that you're doing is that you have a professional account that is very consistent in terms of what you're trying to communicate. So definitely, it's not part of the assignment yet, but if you feel the need to share psychology information, things that you're working on, things that you found interesting in the psychology domain, absolutely, tweet those out, share with your communities beyond what we're doing in these assignments. But one thing that I would highly recommend is that you have your account be consistent. And what I mean by that is that if you're tweeting about psychology, if that's your professional account, make it about psychology, keep it consistent. You can get into debates about psychology, you can get into different areas of psychology, but just make sure that your account is very consistent, because what's eventually going to happen is that other professionals will follow you because of the content that you provide, and your ability or the payback, the payoff that people get for following you is diminished if your accounts are very scattershot and very split. So when I post on my accounts, it is psychology stuff, either educational or scientific, and that's all that I post, because I know that the people that do follow me, that's what they followed me for. And they don't want to hear about anything outside of that. So I don't post about my family life on my Twitter account. So whatever you do, feel free. It's your accounts, but try to keep it consistent, because you want to have that consistent message as part of your presence. All right. So get on that. 5 psychologists from any area that you wish. January 21st, 11:15. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we are going to talk about writing up your introduction and working on your research methodology. So one thing that I like to do in any of my classes is, as much as possible, kind of keep that end goal in your mind. Keep that thing that we're working towards in your mind. And one of the things that we're working towards in this is to disseminate our research. Right? We want a great project that we can eventually show to the world and say, here's some new psychology that you guys need to know about. So one of the end goals that we have is a presentation at the Undergraduate Research Conference. And this is a presentation from a senior seminar student last 2 years ago when I did the senior seminar. And there she is, Ashley Applewhite, and she is presenting her work. And this was on autism and reading stress that she was presenting. And you can actually, if you like to see the kind of level of presentation that occurs at the Undergraduate Research Conference, you can actually check this out. It's on my YouTube channel. It's on a different playlist than where I put all the lectures that we record. All right, so keep that in mind. This is what we're working for. This is our playboard. This is our journey. This is what we're going to be covering today. So we're going to cover some final little bits about the topic, paragraph, and research hypothesis. We're going to talk about what goes into your introduction draft, and we're finally going to end it with a little bit about what to start thinking about your method section. All right. So topic, paragraph, and research hypothesis, writing an introduction, the difference between an introduction and a literature review, and then an intro to some of the things you should start thinking about in terms of research design. And then we'll end it with some group time so that you can bounce some ideas off each other and continue to collaborate and help each other out. All right, so your topic paragraph. We introduced this last class. It's going to be due by midnight tomorrow. So let's get some specifics on this. So this is going to be a description. This is what you need to include. It's a description of the phenomenon to be investigated. So you need some description of what is it that you're actually going to investigate. Something about, this is the phenomenon, this is the behavior, this is the thing that I'm going to investigate. So if it's, the tie between complexity and visual art styles. If it's the relationship between social media use and this, you need some description of the phenomenon that you're going to investigate. You need a definition of terms and descriptions of background theories, and it's not very long, so this is not going to be extensive. It's not going to be intensive, but you do want to make sure that you define any terms that you're using, and you do include some background theories. And then the final thing is a description of the basic method. So again, we're going to be working on method over the next week and a half, but you should have an idea about the basic method that you're going to employ. The basic, we're going to compare these to these and then see if there's a difference here, kind of idea. And then finally, you end it all with your research hypothesis that says if these theories are true and we put them into this situation, then we will find this prediction. This is what we think is going to occur. So that's your prediction. Things that aren't required, APA style, is fine at this point. There's not a lot to write, so we're not going to worry about APA style. Experimental design, again, we're going to be working on experimental design. What we just really want is your basic methodology. All right, so really sort of like we're going to present subjects with this information and we're going to measure this information. Just something that's very basic in that sense, or we're going to analyze these artifacts and we're going to look for these things and just correlate them. Nothing too detailed for this first little bit. But you don't have a clear understanding of how you're going to conduct the experiment or research, that's fine. And any other details beyond the required content. So this is what we're kind of looking for, your outline. Phenomenon to be investigated, description of the terms, a description of background theories, description of basic method, and then your research hypothesis. So let me give you an example of this, and we'll apply it to the previous example that I had. So again, the research that we did on drawing and the blind, and do blind people draw the same way as sighted people? So do they represent space the same way that sighted people represent space? And we presented a blind individual with a model of a wooden house, and we asked them to draw it on a blind raised line drawing kit. And what we found was that their picture of the house was basically exactly like a sighted person perspective picture would be of that upright house. So for the topic, paragraph, and research hypothesis, description of the phenomenon to be investigated. Doesn't have to be very long, but just something like when sighted people draw, they must depict a 3D scene onto a 2D surface. They use specific strategies to accomplish this. Blind people can also draw pictures. Will they use the same strategies? So something as short as that gets across the basic phenomenon. Anybody that read that paragraph would know that we are looking at blind drawings and we're asking ourselves, are they the same as sighted drawings? Definition of terms and description of background theories. So sighted drawing involves sight, which is processed by the visual cortex. Blind drawing involves touch, which is processed by the somatosensory cortex. According to the localization of function theory, different areas of the cortex function differently. So once again, not an in-depth account of your background research or background theories. You don't have to explain too much. So this would be horrible as an introduction to your research paper, because if I didn't explain localization of functioning more than this and than just mentioning it, that's a horrible introduction. But this is not an introduction. This is your topic paragraph. So just a kind of basic information about the background theories that you're using. So, what is the visual cortex process? What is the somatosensory cortex process? What is the localization of function theory? That's basically all that you need in your description of background theories. Description of the basic method. Blind subjects will be asked to draw a picture of a house. A model will be provided. Features of the picture will be analyzed. So at this point, if I was in your shoes, I might not know which features of the picture I'm going to finally decide on analyzing. But I know something about the picture is going to have to be analyzed. Maybe I don't know it's going to be a house that they're drawing, but I know they're going to be drawing something. So give us that basic method. They're going to be presented with something to draw. Features of those drawings are going to be analyzed, and they'll be compared to sighted subjects. And then finally, the research hypothesis, where it goes, if blind drawing and sighted drawing are processed by different areas of the cortex, they should involve different strategies. So that's the basic background theories. Therefore, if we make blind people draw objects, blind pictures should look different from sighted pictures. If we put our subjects into that situation, this is what I predict occurs. And as you've seen, the prediction was wrong. But again, you want to have that prediction made before you go into your experiment. All right, so that is basically your topic paragraph in terms of the content that it needs to contain. So any questions about that so far?
For those of us who don't really have a hypothesis, who are doing non-experimental research, like I'm doing interviews, can we just explain it as trying to examine a phenomenon?
It's usually best if you can go in with some idea of what you should find. So can you refresh me on the specifics of your study?
Seeing how political attitudes develop.
Seeing how political attitudes develop. Okay. So there has to be some background theories that you've seen about how attitudes develop, about how different ideologies get adopted, things like that. You should be able, on the basis of those theories, to make some prediction in terms of what you think you might find if those theories are true. Now, it doesn't have to be, again, the absolute focus of your study. Yours does sound like a more exploratory study, and there are occasionally studies that are done where you say things like, we have really no good idea of why it could go, whether it'll go one way or the other. So we're just kind of exploring to see what happens. But I would say as an exercise, maybe it doesn't make it into your final research paper, but just as an exercise to think through the theories and go through that deductive process, try to make a prediction about, if we find this about a person's political views, then we should also find this about, their interview responses. Something like that, I think, would be a good exercise to go through. And then, if it doesn't end up, this is just the beginning, right? If your experiment veers off a little bit, you're not married to this. But this is just our way of starting to get stuff down, starting to get some decisions made. But you can completely, switch it up later on if it develops in that way. Any other questions? All right, so just kind of give you an idea of how long this would probably be. If you're doing Times New Roman, double-spaced, 1-inch margins all around, so that's your typical APA format. If that's what you format your paper as, then you can expect this to be approximately 1.5 to 2 pages. All right, so again, that only counts if you're doing it double-spaced, Times Roman, 1-inch margins all around. But that should be enough to get all of this information in there without putting in too much at this point, or without missing things out. So I'm thinking about a page and a half, a full page and a little bit, up until about 2 pages would probably be that kind of sweet spot for what I'm looking for. And then this is going to be, some of you have already seen this, is going to be submitted to Canvas assignments. So you just upload it as a Word doc, and that'll be the submission. Yep.
So is this an outline style, or is it an actual reading?
It's like a reading prose style. Okay. I would say full sentences rather than just point forms. Yep.
On Canvas, it's due for tonight at midnight.
It is?
Yes.
All right. That's wrong.
Me a little bit.
Sorry about that. Okay. Well, thanks for letting me know. We move on to writing an introduction. All right. Okay, so writing an introduction. So what do we need to start thinking about to put into our introduction draft? Well, what you want in your introduction is you want to basically explain to your reader why is it that this paper exists? Explain to your reader why is it that it is a good idea for them to go through and read your entire research project. So what you need to communicate in your introduction is, first and foremost, what is the problem? What is the issue that you're investigating? What is the question that you are trying to find an answer to? The next thing you want to do is you want to show them how past research is connected to this reported study. So the problem that is being investigated, that's going to tell them why they should read this report. That's going to let them know why it's a good investment in their time to read what you have written. How the past is connected, how the past research is connected to the current study, that's going to let them know the context of what it is that you are doing. So it's going to anchor your work into a psychology area that they can then either already understand or explore more of. But basically, it gives them an idea of where you're coming from, out of what sort of area of psychology is this work coming from. One thing that review of the past research is going to accomplish is it's going to let them know what led to this problem being researched in the first place. So what is the motivation behind this problem being asked, and what theories does it actually test? So the motivation, what led to this problem being researched, 99 times out of 100, what led to this problem being researched is that nobody has researched it before. What led to this problem being researched is because it somehow was skipped by past research. So going over the past research, you'll usually be able to lead the reader to a point where you say, well, they've had all this past research on this area, but look, this little question here, this little aspect of it, nobody's ever asked this. Or they've had all this research in this past area, but nobody's ever applied it, to this question here or to this phenomenon here. So that's what's going to lead this problem to being researched. And then also, it takes your experiment and your research out of being a very compartmentalized, a very insular type of work. And this last thing makes it very, very important, right? So, for example, when we were doing studies on drawing in the blind, if I could show that a blind subject draws pictures like sighted people, and that's it, then that's a parlor trick, right? That's a thing that you would take to a carnival show, right? You would charge people to come up and see the amazing blind Leonardo da Vinci, right? And wonder and amazement as they draw pictures that look like sighted pictures. That's all it would be good for. And that's not psychology, right? But what we did is we tied it to different theories. And basically, there were theories that said visual information is processed by this visual processor in your mind. And spatial information is processed by these spatial processors in your mind. And the two of them are separate. Visual information goes here, spatial information goes here. And we did this study and we showed that blind people draw just like sighted people do, which means that these two separate processors can't be true. Because if there was two separate processors, the pictures should look different. So our one little parlor trick means that these theories of separate processors crumbled, and you have this idea that both vision and touch go into some shared form of spatial processing. So by tying your study to theories in your background research, you take it from being just sort of like a parlor trick where you're like, oh, look what I can do, or look what this small little piece of information has told us. And when you connect it to something bigger, you either support a theory or you refute a theory, and all of a sudden you increase the importance of your experiment. So you want to tie it to theories that it actually that are being tested, and then this will be the beginning of your story. This will be how you introduce the person into the story of your research, this will be, like it says, your introduction to this entire research project. So you want to make it well written. You want to make it, you want to communicate that importance. You want to communicate that impact that this study can potentially have. And the way that you do that is by telling them about the problem and tying it to existing theories. Because much like every other human being on this planet, scientists will take a look at an introduction, start reading through it, and say stuff like, this does not excite me. This is boring. This doesn't seem too important. Let me put it aside, right? Just the same way that you might open up the first chapter in a book and say, this book sucks, and you put it aside. You want to make sure that you immediately communicate what it is that makes your research important. And one of the ways to do that is to describe the phenomenon that you're looking at, and then tie it to theories. Because as soon as you tie it to theories, you tie it to big ideas in psychology, and your experiment or your study becomes more important. All right, so the basic outline. First thing you want to do, describe the phenomenon in everyday terms. Unless I have to. If I ever pick up a research paper and I look at that first paragraph, and the first paragraph says something like, the tridichotomous theory of integral cross-communication posits that, no, gone. Forget it. I'm not reading this. Because I'm not going to be able to understand it. I don't even know what's going on. What's dichometric research of an interdimensional whatevers. Start with your phenomenon in everyday terms. Start with something that the average intelligent person without specialized knowledge will be able to understand. So when we were writing about drawing in the blind, we did not start with descriptions of somatosensory cortex. We did not start with descriptions of 3D objects and perspective projections onto a 2D plane and conical intersections and tans and cotans and all that other kind of stuff. We started with a basic description. When you draw a picture of a house or of the external world, you are taking a 3D object and you're reproducing it on paper. When a blind person draws, right? So when you describe your phenomenon in these kind of everyday terms, then your reader is on board and they're ready. They kind of understand the basic idea. They're ready to be hit with that more technical information. So you will get to the technical part, but start with some description of the phenomenon in everyday terms, right? Something about your project that if somebody, you can think of it this way, if a friend of yours who's not a psychologist came up to you and said, oh, I heard you're doing an advanced lab, what's it about? How would you tell them what your problem is about? That's kind of your guideline for your phenomenon in everyday terms. Then you're ready to introduce the past research. So once the person knows that you're talking about drawing, and you're talking about blind people and sighted people, and the differences in the way that they draw, then all of a sudden they're ready for somatosensory cortex and visual cortex. Then they're ready for perspective projections and conical sections. Then they're ready for all the prior background research on shared processors, non-shared processors, things like that. Then they're ready for that information. So start with that phenomenon, and then you start introducing the past research. This is what these people think about this part. This is what these researchers found about this part. And you would describe enough of the theories and enough of the research so that the person doesn't have a complete understanding of what this research is about, but knows the aspects of it that are important to your introduction. Following the introducing the past research, you explicitly point out what is missing. You explicitly point out that something is not there, that there is a section of psychology that is missing and nobody knows what goes into that section. So this showing a gap in the research is very important because this is why your paper exists and this is why it's a good reason for somebody to read your paper. So you show them the past research and then you point out even with all this past research, this question is still unknown, and then you just indicate that you're going to fill that gap. You are going to answer that question. In this study, I will investigate this thing. In this study, we'll conduct, an analysis of this to answer this question. In this study, we will be looking into, what is the answer to the phenomenon. And then you end with a hypothesis. And then you end with if these theories are true and we do what we propose to do, then we will find this prediction, right? If these other theories are true and we do what we're supposed to do, then we will find this other prediction. And that's usually the way that you lead into your method section. All right, any questions so far on this basic outline of your intro? All right, so we alluded to this. Let's make it concrete. For that phenomenon, no jargon. So do not use terms. People are not ready for them yet, right? Do not use technical names for things. People aren't ready for them yet. Devote one paragraph. It doesn't have to be very long, but devote one paragraph to just describing the phenomenon in as everyday terms as you can, so that you get your reader on board, so that they know, what it is that they're in store for, so they can prepare their mind. This is literally like for a little child when you open up that fairy tale book and they hear once upon a time, and immediately their mind starts to think, oh, okay, I get it. Dragons and talking bears and princesses and castles, all of those things I'm expecting. Do the same thing for your reader, right? Describe this in everyday terms, the phenomena that you're going to be investigating. Don't use any jargon. When you introduce the past theories, this is your opportunity to introduce any definitions that you need to and any theories that you need to, right? So if you need to talk about perspective projection, this is the point where you can say, this is what perspective projection is, and give them the citations and the references that they need. If I need to start talking about localization of function, this is the section where I say, all right, localization of function is the idea that different areas of the brain are specialized for different purposes. For example, so-and-so found that this area of the brain is specialized for speech. Another person found that this area of the brain is specialized, for this. So this introduction is where you include any, and this is a big thing, necessary definitions and theories. Necessary means that it's necessary for your argument. So this is one of the hardest things to do, especially when you read something and you struggle through it, and only 20% of it is necessary for your paper, but you spent a lot of time reading the other 80%. Sometimes I feel the need that somebody's going to hear about it. Like I went through it, so somebody is going to see the output of my hard work. But if it's not part of the story, if it's not required for the story, then you don't put it in. So use that as your guideline. It's the necessary definitions and the necessary theories. Gap in your research, what's missing? Basically, the answer to your experiment is what's missing. So point that out. Research hasn't been done on this particular area. Nobody's looked at this particular variable. Nobody's thought of this particular application. That's what's missing. That's what your project is going to answer. And then, this is very important, indicate that you will fill in that missing gap. So, if you do this well, and you do this well, and you do this well, then they should be able to infer this. They should be able to infer, how is it that you're going to answer this question? But we never want our readers to have to infer too much, right? We never want to leave too much to their imagination. So make sure that you state that explicitly and you say, yes, this is what we're going to answer and this is how we're going to do it. And then finally, you have a prediction from your theories and you end with that prediction. If these theories are true, then in this situation, we should find this prediction occurs. And then that's the end of your intro, and they're ready to read about your method section. Any questions so far? All right. So let's just real quickly talk about a checklist for the critical reader. which is also good for the critical writer. So in your introduction, when you have finished writing your introduction, you should be able, or somebody else should be able to answer these questions. Number one, what is the author's goal? What is the author trying to accomplish? That needs to be communicated in your introduction. Number two, what hypothesis will be tested in this experiment? So that's going to be very clear. That is going to be the last paragraph in your introduction. If these theories are true, then we will find this in this study. And then the last thing is that you should have enough information in your introduction that an intelligent reader, if they have to design their own experiment or corpus analysis to test your hypothesis, they have an idea of what it is that they're going to do. So their idea might not match your idea. Their final decision on this might not match your final decision. But if they get to the end of your hypothesis and they say to themselves, or the end of your intro, and they say to themselves, I have no idea how this is going to be tested, you have failed as a writer for your introduction. So you should leave them at the end with some sort of an idea of what it is that you're going to be doing. And that should be communicated by the information that you've presented in your introduction. All right, moving along, literature reviews. This is not a literature review. So you're writing an intro. You're not writing a literature review. So why do I point that out? It's because sometimes people get a little bit confused between the two. So they're like, oh, an introduction is going to have background information, background theories. It's like I'm reviewing the literature. Not the case. So an introduction is not the same as a literature review. And sometimes I think people get confused because you do need to review some of your background literature, right? You do need to include background information, background theories, background literature into your introduction section. But the question is how much do you need to put in there? And that's where one of the big differences between an introduction and a literature review. In a literature review, everything goes in. So if you're doing a literature review about developmental psychology and the effects of social media on developing attention spans, you need to put in a good literature review just about every study that's ever been done on that area. And you need to classify them, you need to put them in different categories, you need to summarize their findings and the results. Everything goes in. For an introduction, the background information that you need enough information to tell your story, to communicate your idea, and you need enough information to convince your reader. But it by no means has to be exhaustive, right? So this is where you need to have a little bit of critical thinking. You need to have a little bit of a thought process going on. So first and foremost, everything in your introduction and everything in your research paper should be designed to tell your story. And your story is that we found this, right? Your end result, your end goal is to tell people we found this and this is what it means, right? That is your kind of end goal to your story. At one point in the discussion, you're going to say as your big payoff, we found this and then this is what it means for psychology. Everything points to that. And what this means is that if you have read something and it does not contribute to telling your story, it does not point your reader towards your final destination, it does not go into your introduction. So even if it's something that somebody in that area should know, even if it's something that would be included in a literature review, if it's not part of your story, it doesn't go into your final introduction. So, you know, if, for example, you read an article that looked at the effects of social media on the elderly and on young children, and you're looking at the effects of social media, but you're not looking at differences in ages, then a discussion of the differences between the elderly and children and their effects on the effects of social media on them does not belong in your introduction. Because if you devote a paragraph to, oh, they found that elderly individuals on social media react in this way. On the other hand, they found that young people on social media reacted this way, and those differences were attributed to the amount of fluid intelligence versus crystallized intelligence, in their results. If you have that paragraph in your introduction, your reader is going to look for elderly versus young individuals for the rest of your study. And when they don't find it, they will be confused. And you do not want to confuse your reader. So tailor your introduction to present the information that you need in order to tell your story, but no more information than that, right? You don't want to bog down your reader in an extensive review of the entire area. You basically just want to say, this is what you need to know. Here is the information that you need for my story. That's what's going into the introduction. So use that as a way of honing and refining your introduction. Another good way to think of this is, you can look this up. There's a principle in theater and in storytelling called Chekhov's gun. And it's the idea that if you are watching a play and you see a gun on the wall, mounted on the wall in the first act, that gun better be fired by the third act, right? Because if you're going to introduce something into the story, you better use it somewhere else in the story. Same thing with research writing. If you introduce an idea, or if you make a distinction, or if you make a point of reporting something, it needs to somehow tie into your eventual goal. If it doesn't, leave it out. There's no need to flex your cognitive psychology muscles and prove how much you know about your area. Save that for your master's thesis and for your PhD thesis. Those will include literature reviews. But for this project, we don't need an extensive review of everything. We just need the information that you need for your argument, for your story. That being said, don't also forget to convince your reader. So if you have 5 different sources, for example, that all make the same point, include all 5 sources in your reference section, right? So for the somatosensory cortex is involved in touch, I wouldn't cite just one person for that citation. I would cite as many people as I have, 5, 6 individuals, just to be able to convince your reader. So leave out a piece of information if it's distracting and it's not part of your story, but make sure that you have information in there that is required to convince your reader that what you're saying is the real deal. All right. So that is writing an introduction. Any questions about that? Issues? Concerns? Yep.
How long was this one supposed to be?
That is a good question. The length of the introduction will... The short answer to that is going to be long enough. And it'll be long enough to achieve those 2 goals. What I typically find is that for an advanced lab, double-spaced, Times Roman, 1-inch margins all around, typically for introduction, I'm thinking like 4 pages. So it's not massive, right? We're not writing, it's different than a dissertation, right? So when you're doing your graduate work and you have to do your dissertation, part of your dissertation is convincing your committee that you know the area. And part of the ways you do that is you stuff your dissertation with just about everything that you've read. And you comment and summarize and talk about it. That's why my master's dissertation was like 90-something pages long. The publication from that master's dissertation was only about 16 pages long, right? So you can imagine, you can see the difference there. The dissertation was let me convince you that this is my work and I know this area. The publication was, let me tell you my story. So there's a difference there. So when you're writing your intro, and again, it'll be different. This is one of the reasons why we're doing the peer reviews. Try to write enough that you tell your story. Don't include information that you're not going to use. Don't include theories that you're not going to use. Don't include findings that don't point towards where you're eventually going to go. But then also put in enough to convince your reader. So don't just mention a study, give a little bit of information about it. Give a little bit of, in this previous study, they looked at, this aspect of social media versus this aspect, and they found that attention spans tend to whatever. Give a little bit of that description because that's going to help convince your reader. But again, we're looking at I'm thinking typically it'll be about 4 pages. If you go less, as long as you told your story and you convinced your reader and you included these things in there, that's fine. If you go over, as long as you told your story and convinced your reader and included those things, that's fine as well. It's going to be different for different people because we got different, stories to tell. But like I said, I'm thinking about like a 4-pager would probably be a good place to shoot for. Mm-hmm.
So we're thinking 1 to 2 pages for topic paragraph and then about 4 pages for the introduction. So roughly 5 to 6 pages for
Yeah, so the topic paragraph is separate from your introduction. Topic paragraph's not going to make it into your final research paper. That's just kind of your first getting ideas down on paper thing. And then the introduction is going to be like another 4 pages. So there's going to be overlap. Don't get me wrong. I mean, the topic paragraph has a lot of the same ideas that you're going to be putting into your introduction, but they're 2 separate things. And your topic paragraph will not make it into your final research paper. Is that, yeah?
I guess I'm still kind of confused because we're supposed to write the topic paragraph and research hypothesis, and you said that it would be about 1 to 2 pages.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we're turning in, but then we're also turning in the introduction, which is you're saying about 4 pages, so that would be about 5 to 6 pages.
Yeah, no, they're 2 different assignments.
We're just doing the topic and the hypothesis.
Oh, so we're not doing it.
No, the introductions due like on the 21st by midnight. Yeah.
Okay, so that's what I was missing.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Good. All right. Yeah, no, the topic paragraph is, like I said, that 1.5 pages.
Right.
This, what we're talking about now is the introduction, but you'll notice a lot of the same stuff is going to be on both. So you can almost kind of see it as your topic paragraph is almost like an outline of your introduction without having all the information that you're going to need. All right. Any other questions about this stuff? Okay. So what we're going to do now, I don't know exactly how much time we're going to have for group work, but I do want to start talking about research design because I do want to have these kind of issues start to be going around in your mind, start making decisions about them, or at least be aware of them. And what I'm going to try to do is on Thursday, we'll have a little bit more time to sort of get together in groups and hammer out some stuff with each other. But at this point, again, start thinking about your introduction. Start thinking about where you're going to point your reader, how you're going to take them, start them off on this journey. And then what we're going to be doing over the next about week and a half is we're going to start to think about finalizing questions about our research design. So you can write an introduction without knowing exactly what you're going to be doing in your experiment or your corpus analysis, but you can't write a method without knowing exactly what you're doing, and you can't do the experiment without knowing exactly what you're doing. So now would be a good time to start thinking about exactly what it is that we're going to be doing. All right, so things to start thinking about when you are planning out your experiment, and things to get very clear about. So up until now, we've been talking about, well, I'm looking at the effects of this on this, so I want to test if this is related to this, and that's fine, but right now we have to start thinking about more concretely. So if you're doing an experiment, if you are doing an intervention with human subjects or with animal subjects where you are interacting with them and collecting data from them and about them, then things you got to start asking, number one, what is your independent variable or variables? So do you got the one variable, do you got 2 variables or more? and what are the levels of those independent variables. So if you're doing a study on levels of anxiety and its effect on memory, levels of anxiety is going to be your independent variable. And start to think about what are the levels. Is it going to be two groups, anxious versus non-anxious? Are we going to have three levels, calmed versus normal versus anxious? How are we going to measure that? What are the levels of our independent variable actually going to be? Or is it continuous? Is it going to be something that you measure on a continuous scale? So age is a great one to kind of show for an independent variable, where you can either do it in terms of we're going to test young individuals, 12 or under, versus teenagers, 18 or under, versus young adults, 18 to 30, versus elderly adults, 30 and up, I guess. Or are you going to do a continuous, where you're saying we'll just ask them for their age, right? And we'll have whatever their age is, it'll be a continuous variable. So start thinking about that, which way are you going to code your independent variables. And then if you're doing a corpus analysis, you got to do the exact same thing. So if you're doing a corpus analysis, you have a pseudo-independent variable. You have an independent variable that you might not be able to assign, but you're definitely categorizing according to that independent variable. So you want to start asking yourself, what are the levels of this independent variable? Is it continuous? Is it not continuous? You want to start getting clear on those. So for example, when I was doing one of my comic studies, and we were looking at the effects of metaphorical and literal pictorial devices on and their use in combinations in art, our independent variables was what type of a device was used. Is it a metaphorical device or is it a literal device? And they had different levels as well. So it was only a two level. It was either metaphorical or it was literal. There was no kind of in between. So these are the kind of decisions that you need to start making. There were different ways of conceptualizing this. So I have received feedback where people were saying, well, this one is metaphorical, but this one was figurative. This one is literal, but this one is, incidental. And you're like, all right, maybe it should have been 4 levels. But it's time to start making those decisions. So think about your independent variables and how you're going to split up those categories. Is it going to be levels or is it going to be continuous? For a corpus analysis and for an experiment, what is your dependent variable? So once again, what are the levels, or is it continuous? And that applies for both. So start to think about what is it that you are going to measure specifically. And again, this is kind of taking it from, we're going to measure perception of beauty. And start asking yourself, what is that dependent measure? How are we going to measure it? Are they going to measure it on a scale? Are we going to use a survey for beauty? Is it going to be continuous, or is it going to be individual levels? How are we going to measure that dependent variable? And that goes for corpus analyses as well. How are you going to measure the aspects that you're going to be investigating? How are you going to get that out of the data that you're looking at? All right. So, for example, our dependent variable in the comic book analysis study, we had 3 literal devices, we had 2 metaphorical devices, and our dependent variable was how many literal devices did they use and how many metaphorical devices did they use. So we had 2 dependent variables, and that was it. Out of the 3, how many literal? Out of the 2, how many metaphorical devices? So again, start thinking about that. If you're doing an experiment, so this is, this is for both experiment and corpus analysis. How many conditions is this going to be for a fully factorial design? So what I mean by that is take a look at your independent variables and ask yourself, if I was to do every single combination of these independent variables, how many conditions am I going to need? And you need as many conditions as levels when you multiply them together. So if you say to yourself, all right, I'm going to take a look at ability, and it's either going to be expert or novice. And I'm going to look at ages. And it's either going to be children versus adults versus elderly. And I also want to look at gender. And it's going to be males versus females. And I'm also going to look at, well, that's enough for right now. All right, so let's say that those are the three variables that you wanted to look at. To get a full factorial design on this, you're going to have 2 times 3 is 6 times 2 is 12 separate categories. So you're going to have male children who are experts. You're going to have male children who are novices. You're going to have male adults who are experts. You're going to have male adults who are novices. Male elderly who are experts. Male elderly who are novice. Female children who are experts. Female children who are novice, right? You're going to have every single combination. You're going to have 12 combinations in your study. So that is something to start thinking about. How many combinations are you going to have in your study? So as you go through and you start planning, put in the variables that you want, put in the levels that you want, and then at this point, just kind of figure out how many conditions are you going to need in order to get all those levels either into your experiment, or how many conditions are you going to need to get all those levels into your corpus analysis, right? So if you want to look at literal and metaphorical, devices, and you want to look at realistic versus cartoony, and you want to look at 1950s images versus 1960s versus 1970s versus 1980s versus 1990s versus the 2000s, you're looking at 20 different categories. So get a handle on how many different categories you're going to be needing for your research design. All right, and this is going to be very important for this. This will be very important in just a moment. For the experimental people, try to figure out which of your variables are going to be within subjects. And that means which of your variables are going to be experienced by everybody in your experiment, right? So if we had, let me add at least one that we can do this on. If this was a memory test, and I also included type, and it was pictures versus words, right? Pictures versus words, that can be within subjects variable, because everybody can do pictures, and then in that same experiment, everybody can do words, right? There's no problem there. There's no problem to say, try to memorize these 30 words, here's your test. Try to memorize these 30 pictures, here's your test, right? So these can be within subjects, and within subjects, you can make a variable, a within subjects variable, if there are no carryover effects and there's no issues with fatigue. So learning words will not impact your ability to learn pictures. Learning pictures will not impact your ability to learn words. There's no carryover effects. And as long as they're not going for an inordinate amount of time, there's going to be no fatigue effects, and you can counterbalance this as well. But if you can do within subjects, you're highly recommended to do that because it increases the power of your experiment when you're able to run your subjects on every single condition. So think about the conditions that you can run your subjects on more than, in the experiment, that you can run all your subjects on in the experiment. And those are your within subjects. Your other variables are going to be between subjects. And those are the ones that do have carryover effects, or those are the ones that do have issues with fatigue. Or, and I don't have this up here, those are the ones that you cannot assign. So you cannot assign people randomly to expert versus novice. They either come in with expertise or they come in as a novice. So you can't have them run the experiment once as an expert and then again as a novice. This has to be between subject. Male versus female. You can't have somebody and assign them to be a male for that experiment and then at the end of it say, now you're a female, let's do it again. So some of these, if they're pseudo-independent, you can't assign them. Or if there's carryover effects or issues with fatigue, they have to be between subject designs. And then the last thing that you want to do, so this is why I'm asking, this is why you want to start thinking about this. Let's say that this was our experiment. because everybody can be run on this variable, we can take it out of our factorial analysis, right? We can take it out of the number of conditions that we have, because everybody's going to be doing pictures, everybody's going to be doing words. So we got 2 times 3 times 2, that's 12 different conditions. Once we figure that out, that we have 12 separate conditions, and all 12 of them will be run on pictures, and all 12 of them will be run on words. That's why we didn't include this. It's a within subjects analysis. Once you determine how many between subjects categories you have, you are then ready to determine how many subjects do you need in order to get 5 subjects per condition. And 5 subjects per condition is typically the bare minimum, and I mean like really minimum, to do any sort of statistical analyses, inferential statistics on your data. So if I was doing this experiment and I had these 12 conditions and I needed 5 minimum, I'm looking at 60 subjects. And that is just something that you want to think about before you delve into this. Because 60 subjects, I would say, for an advanced lab, that's getting into the upper levels of how many subjects you're going to be able to get, right? So family and friends, and recruiting on family and friends, which is what we call posting to Facebook, and recruiting from the SONA system, getting it from the intro psych students. You could, if you get it out there early enough, probably get yourself, 60 subjects. We were just talking with Dr. Rodriguez. He was talking about his students had like 40 subjects, so that's doable. However, that's just the bare minimum, right? Chances are you might fall short, which means that this is probably not a great design to go with, which means that maybe you need to rethink male versus female. And then all of a sudden, these 6 conditions, these 12 conditions go back down to 6, and you only need 30 subjects to get 5 per. So this will help you kind of make decisions in terms of how to design your experiment, which things need to be kept in, which things need to be taken out. Because if you do this analysis and you find that you need 120 subjects to run your experiment, I'll tell you right now, you have a very slim chance of getting that many. And this is with 5 subjects per condition, which is like minimum that you would want to get. And then for the corpus analysis, same idea. How many analyses would you need to have 5 observations per condition? So when we were doing the one of our comic book analyses, we wanted to make sure that when we had this one where there was 4 separate categories, we wanted to make sure that we found at least 5 instances that fell into each category. Otherwise, it's very difficult to do the proper analyses. So again, this is just a way of sort of estimating what it is that you're going to have access to, the resources. It's like the feasibility of your experiment. And if you find that your experiment is not going to work, it's going to require too many subjects, it's time to go back and just redesign the experiment. So tweak it a little bit, maybe take out one of the variables that isn't, as important to your study, or if you can, move variables to within subject variables if there's a way to do that as well. All right, and then for the experiment, for the experimental people, you want to start estimating the total time that you're going to need for your experiment. So if you're taking a look at this and you're saying to yourself, all right, I'm going to test them with pictures versus words. And just because I want to make sure that my data is reliable, I'm going to give them 10 sets of 50 pictures each, and I'm going to give them 10 sets of 20 words each, and they're going to test these, and I'm going to give them 5-minute breaks between each list just to make sure that they stay refreshed, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do this. And on average, I think that my experiment is going to take 120 minutes. That's how long it's going to take a subject to run my experiment. You're going to get 0 subjects. Nobody in our the chances of getting somebody to sign up for this is lower. The longer your experiment, the lower your chance of actually getting subjects to sign up. So what I would recommend is if you can keep your experiment to like the 30-minute mark. That's what we find typically gets the most signups. You go over 30 minutes and people will start to choose the 30-minute experiments. If you go under that time, sometimes you just can't do the experiment and be a lot of time. 30 minutes, I think, is what you're trying to shoot for. So if your experimental design ends up with an experiment that goes over an hour, it's time to take a hard look at, can you shorten it? Can you remove some things? Can you do it in a more efficient way? Just so that you have the feasibility of getting this thing done. I have participated in experiments and I have run experiments that had like 8 to 10 hour run times for subjects. So we would do this over the course of a couple of weeks. And these were experiments that I did in the color lab. And basically the subjects in these experiments were other people in my color lab. So we would trade experimental, work with like subject time with each other. And they would basically come up to me and say, I got this new experiment coming up, and I did yours last week, which took 10 hours. You want to do mine this week? And I was like, yeah, let's do it. And you would sit there across a variety of days for 2 hours at a time doing the experiment. There's no way I would do that as an intro psych student, right? There was no way that somebody came up to me and said, you got 10 hours to run an experiment and I'm an intro psych student? No. I did this because I felt a commitment to my lab. People that you recruit, they won't have that commitment. So think of that, right? We want the science to be great. We want the science to be logical and correct, but at the same time, we want it to be doable. And if you end up designing an experiment that's going to take 4 hours, you're going to get to the end of the semester and you will have one person who ran that experiment, and that'll be your significant other, and that's it, right? So we don't want to put ourselves into that position. All right, so we kind of ran out of time for group time today, so I'll just put this up here right now. So this is what I want you to start thinking about. So download the PowerPoint slides, and if you're planning an experiment, start trying to answer as many questions of these as you can. If you're doing a corpus analysis, start trying to answer as many of these questions as you can. And at this point, what we're really doing is we're looking for feasibility. This is kind of like, let's plan it out, and we'll think about, is this doable? And at this stage, if you find that your experiment or your corpus analysis is not doable, right, and you can't, after answering these questions, you're like, I'm going to need 4,000 subjects, and my experiment's going to take 3 hours per subject. It's time to go back, change some of these things, so that you can come up with an experiment or a corpus analysis that answers your question, but at the same time is something that can actually be done in the real world. All right, any final questions about anything? We only got about like 2 minutes left. We'll do some group work on these issues next time, but any questions about anything before we wrap it up? Yep.
I found a book that I might use.
Mm-hmm.
It's fairly old. It's from 1967. How old of sources can we bring in?
You can use stone tablets from ancient times if you want. That's a good question too. So there is no expiry date on science. So I have referenced the writings of Leonardo da Vinci in some of my work because he wrote on stuff that I've been doing. So the age of your references is not an issue. The time that it becomes an issue is that if they're all outdated. So not even outdated, it could be very relevant. But if all of your references are like from the 90s or before, then people are going to realize that you don't know anything about what happened in the last 30 years. So you can go as old as you want, but definitely for your references, for your background information, make sure that you have some recent stuff to show the reader and for yourself that you are up to the current state of any particular area. All right, any other questions about anything before we wrap it up? All right, thanks for coming, and we will see you all next week. And next week. We'll see you all next time. And make sure you get that topic paragraph in. It's due by midnight tomorrow. I fixed that. And other than that, have a good couple of days.